18th century.
Yes, it's in fact that's at best. It's quite possibly lower than it was in 1750.
Can we take the population question to you, Rosersweet? People must have wondered what was going on, because we were an agricultural country. We were still massively agricultural in 1800. I can't remember, 55%, something like that. People worked on the land. You tell me if I'm wrong.
No.
37%.
Well, you've probably got about 37%.
Oh, 37 by 18, 55%. That's right. 55 in 1700.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Still a lot. Now they're going away. Quite a lot of them are going away. Do people feel that the country is draining population because people are going abroad and so on and so forth?
Well, one of the reasons why people like Goldsmith or other critics were hostile to enclosure was the fear that it was leading to depopulation of rural areas, that they thought that people were losing their livelihood from the land, therefore would have to move away, and that they were moving to the cities. And Richard Price, in his observations on reversionary payments, is making this in 1771, is making precisely this argument, that he sees London in particular growing, and what he also is pointing out is that London is growing at a faster rate than it's reproducing itself. He's looking at the bills of mortality and showing that the number of deaths exceeds the number of births. So he's saying, well, where's this population coming from? It's coming from the land. It's the product of people being driven off the land by enclosure. And so London is eating up the population, and it's corrupting the population. It's creating an effeminate, luxurious, morally corrupt population. And all these independent, bold, sturdy peasants who would have fought in the navy or in the army are being lost and jeopardising the national interest. Whether enclosure really drove population growth in cities is an entirely different matter. Some people might have been released from the land after enclosure, and they might have moved to towns. But the areas of greatest urban growth don't match up with the areas where there was most widespread enclosure during the 18th century. And what you're more likely to get is pools of unemployment in areas like the southeast where there was enclosure, because there's no obvious time for people to migrate to. Whereas the biggest towns which are growing most rapidly tend to be ports or places like Birmingham and Manchester, where migration, yes, it might, enclosure might have contributed to it, but it's also internal population growth to the towns.
But enclosure is contributing very much to the feeding of the population, Mark Overton, isn't it?
Indeed. Well, agricultural production is. I mean, there's the relationship between then enclosure and agricultural production. But yes, and really, in 1750, England was a net exporter of agricultural food. And that was, and by 1800 it was more or less even. So this period of rapid population growth with the Industrial Revolution initially was fed by home production, to which new agricultural methods were obviously vital, and enclosure made their contribution to that. But just on this point about population growth, I mean, as I mentioned, when you change a village from arable farming to pasture farming, you need fewer people. And it's quite clear that in some villages the population did fall or people did move. But on the other hand, it wasn't on such a scale as to cause the massive urban growth that took place, which really came around through what demographers call natural increase.
Yeah. And that's the earliest population growth in cities starts around about 1700, that towns outside London are really beginning to grow quite rapidly. And this is when the overall population of the country is more or less stagnant, and when there's actually not that much enclosure taking place.
They do grow, it's true, but I mean, there is natural increase everywhere, and the fact is that natural increase to a place like Herefordshire is pretty low in the terms from the early 19th to 20th century. One of the reasons for that is a lot of people leave.
Yeah.
A lot of people, and Hereford is actually quite near Birmingham, which is a useful a useful example for you to use. So, and I think that we are looking, certainly in the cities that I'm aware of, where there are studies, and I'm not aware of all the cities you mentioned, there is movement from rural areas to city, which is sometimes displacement.
Yeah.
And not necessarily, but I mean, although there are jobs in rural areas, a lot of the jobs that then appear, there are a lot of ploughman jobs, and they are badly paid. Yeah. And so in a situation where you used to be a tenant farmer, and now there are some ploughman jobs, but actually you can get 5 shillings, 10 shillings more a week by moving to an urban environment 20, 30 miles away.
Exactly.
They've been argued over since they happened, and they're being argued over this morning by you. What was Karl Marx's version of this, Mark Overton?
Well, Karl Marx, having identified and defined capitalism as something that emerged from feudalism that preceded it, he had to find a mechanism whereby you got from one to the other. And he looked around for some empirical process that would lead you from feudalism to capitalism. And parliamentary enclosure really fitted the bill because it killed two birds with one stone.
Because at the end of feudalism, you didn't have people there in order to fight for you in wars, because the idea of taking people off to wars with you had faded away.
Yeah, he was talking about feudalism in a more of an economic sense, where it defined relationships.
But the basis was a military relationship.
It was, indeed. But in looking to how you got the establishment of capitalism, you needed two things. You needed private property rights, and enclosure gave you private property rights, and you needed a proletariat. I think Marx found it very difficult to understand, despite wages, why people would work in factories for 16 hours a day or whatever. It's extremely unpleasant environment, and he writes at length about this. And the problem for him was, why did these people do this? Why did they go into these factories? And the answer was they were driven off the land by enclosure.
And do you think he was right, Murray Pittock?
I think that there is merit in the point. Yes, I mean, I think that one of the interesting. I don't think he's absolutely right. One of the interesting things I think is that those those historians have been influenced by Marx. For example, E.P. Thompson, don't adopt a strict Marxist point, but in looking at the details of enclosure, they do say that the point has some validity. I think, frankly, the point would not continue to be debated if it had no validity at all. So I think the discussion we should be having is about how much validity it's got.
Well, how much validity does it have, Rosemary?
Yes, well, I think there is some. The agricultural labour workforce did become proletarianised over the course of the 18th century, but it was happening anyway. It wasn't dependent upon enclosure. It was a trend that was happening anyway. Enclosure exacerbated it. And the trend to absolute property rights, private property, yes, that was exacerbated, or at least assisted by enclosure, but it wasn't dependent upon. I think Marx uses enclosure as the key to unlock the problem, where it was simply part of a much broader structural transformation in the economy. So, in the 18th century, people took enclosure as a means of explaining all kinds of ills, from rising poor rates to depopulation to criminality and immorality in the metropolis. Well, similarly, in the 19th and 20th centuries, historians have used enclosure to explain historical changes, and it's a very easy and seductive way of explaining change, but it's actually more complicated.
Murray Pittock, when you said I know you want to say something, but after you said what you want to say, could you answer? Could you tell us whether enclosures changed the notion of what land ownership meant in this country?
I think that enclosures had a significant effect on the perception of the landowner as an increasingly alien landowning class, an increasingly alien group from the generality of the population. And I also think that it helped to create, by virtue of its knock-on effects, for example, the increase in clergy salaries in England and the aspirational quality of landowning, especially improved land in the 18th century, helped to create the kind of counter-society which developed as the social structure of the countryside in the 19th century. The counter-society, the sense of were you in or were you out? Were you a member of the gentry? Who did you dine with? What kind of group you're involved in? The kind of world that is the world of Jane Austen's novels and those which succeeded it. That kind of society actually develops on the basis of a structure which is strongly geared to the importance and value of land, which is itself a development of the final enclosures of the third of common land that was still common in 1700 during the century that followed it.
Mark?
Sorry?
Do you want to follow that up? You're looking
back when I mentioned Jane Austen.
Sorry,
Sorry
to disturb your rest.
you moved into territory out of my ken. No, I think really, from the point of view of Marx, I mean, he was wrong. I mean, he was wrong in his empirical mechanism. That's what I would say. He was wrong in ascribing these things to enclosure. I think most historians now agree that, if you like, the proletariat generated itself. And also, I have to say that enclosure was probably not a necessary condition to provide enough food to actually feed the population. In some ways, it's very conspicuous because of the evidence it produced, but it marks almost the end of a process that's been going on for a very long time. I mean, in terms of urbanisation, I mean, a tenth of the population lived in London in 1700 before enclosure began. I mean, that's a vast number of people. So I think significant and as symbolic, if you like, as enclosures are, to ascribe all these consequences to them is probably going a little bit too far.
Yeah, but people have done, and Marx did, and as has been said, I think Murray said this, that, or one of you said it, that E.P. Thompson, the author of the Making of the English Working Classes, described enclosures as little more than an act of theft. Would you like to develop that?
Yes, well, Thompson saw it as an act of class robbery, that he saw it as the destruction of one form of economy, what he called the moral economy, which was based on reciprocal obligations, customary right, and a much stronger sense of community, where the gap between the elite and the labouring sort wasn't so wide, where you had a much stronger sense of mutual obligation, to one where it's a market economy driven by market relations, where you have what he called the patricians and the plebs, where the plebs lost out completely. They were so short by the patricians, who consolidated all the rights, and so the customary rights disappeared, and only the absolute rights of property, as sanctioned by Parliament. As Marx said, Parliament trumps customary rights. And Thompson saw this as a transformation which pervaded agriculture, which pervaded the workplace, which pervaded the whole of British society, and a transformation which took place in the 18th century, ushering in the 19th century era of full-blown capitalism.
Did he say from a moral to a political economy? Was that the phrase he used? Yes. Yeah. What exactly did he mean by that, do you think, Murray?
It means an economy which is based, moving away from an economy which is based on reciprocity over a wide range of kinds of exchange, to one which is based on exchange value and fundamentally a capitalist economy. But I have to say, I think Rosemary over-schematizes E.P. Thompson here, and I think that he's much more sensitive to individual locations and individual events of enclosure, and he's very keen to distinguish those that were actually brought about by Act of Parliament and those which occurred through consent or through landlord, or I suppose conspiracy is too strong a word, but the agreement, shall we say, of law officers with the landlord interest locally. I think that Thompson's case is fundamentally a more complex, and it's stronger by being more complex. This is not an easy issue which can be resolved either down the route of proletarian self-fashioning, the proletariat invented itself, or on the other hand, a simple crude Marxist view that everybody who ended up in the industrial cities came from the rural economy, were displaced by evil capitalist landowners. I don't think either of those views is really tenable. I think we need, people have to find the place on the spectrum between them.
Can I end up where I almost began, Rosemary? An idea that a lot of people have about the enclosures is the bold peasantry, and Wordsworth in his poem Michael, and we've quoted one way or another Goldsmith and John Clyde and so forth. How far do you think that obtains, finally? Do you think they were romanticising the plight and the position of the bold peasantry, or do you think that they were actually describing it more or less accurately?
It's very difficult to know how much of the bold peasantry actually existed. As we said, certain areas of the country had already been largely enclosed.
But you gave them great value earlier, didn't you?
Yes,
you said they were they received ideas, they were dependent.
No, this is what contemporaries said they did, but the extent to which contemporaries were constructing this image of what they believed an ideal of a peasantry was, and the extent to which such people actually existed, is quite hard to establish. But in certain areas we do know they existed. Northamptonshire, for example, there is very convincing work to show that there were a lot of villages which did consist of these sturdy individuals who
also weren't entirely dependent on the benefits of others, and therefore they could take part in. They were regarded as possible treasonous persons.
Exactly, and they weren't beholden to anybody. So this was where their independence came from. That they weren't beholden. They weren't locked into any kind of relationship with an employer, or through charity, or through poor relief. They were independent, and it is quite clear too that after enclosure, poor rates went up. More people had to be supported by the poor rates. So there is some evidence, but these people don't leave much in the records as historical traces from which we can reconstruct them.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you, Rosemary Sweet, Murray Pittock and Mark Overton. And next week we'll be talking about the ideas about the brain, the history of ideas about the brain. Thank you very much for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/radio4.